20 million people were watching live television coverage of the 36th annual Grammy Awards. Whitney Houston was scheduled to perform "I Will Always Love You" in exactly 20 minutes, the song that had dominated the airwaves for over a year and become the best-selling single by a female artist in history. Her performance was the most anticipated moment of the entire evening, the climax that everyone from coast to coast was waiting to witness. The stage was set. The orchestra was ready. The cameras were positioned. Everything was perfect, except for one critical problem. In her dressing room backstage, Whitney Houston was having a complete mental breakdown. She was on the floor, hyperventilating, crying uncontrollably, and repeating over and over that she couldn't do it, that she couldn't go out there, that everyone was going to see her fail on live television in front of 20 million people. Her team was in full panic mode, trying desperately to calm her down, but nothing was working. The clock was ticking. 19 minutes until showtime. And Whitney Houston, the greatest voice of her generation, was absolutely certain she had forgotten how to sing. The year leading up to the 1994 Grammys had been the most successful and simultaneously most exhausting period of Whitney Houston's career. "I Will Always Love You" had spent 14 consecutive weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, a feat that hadn't been accomplished since 1977. The Bodyguard soundtrack had sold over 17 million copies in the United States alone. Whitney had become not just a star, but a global phenomenon, her voice instantly recognizable in every corner of the world. But with that level of success came a pressure that was almost unbearable. Every performance had to be perfect. Every note had to be flawless. Every public appearance had to reinforce the image of Whitney Houston as an untouchable vocal goddess who never made mistakes. The problem was that Whitney was human, and humans make mistakes. The more successful she became, the more terrified she was of falling short of the impossible standard she had set for herself. In the weeks leading up to the Grammys, Whitney had been experiencing what her close friends recognized as severe performance anxiety. She would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that she had lost her voice. She would practice the same runs and riffs for hours, obsessively searching for any sign of imperfection. She stopped eating properly because anxiety had destroyed her appetite. Her assistant, Robin Crawford, had noticed that Whitney was losing weight, losing sleep, and losing her joy in the very thing that had once made her happiest. Singing had become a source of terror rather than pleasure. The Grammy performance was particularly daunting because it wasn't just any performance. This was live television with no second takes, no studio magic, no safety net. 20 million people would be watching in real time, and millions more around the world. Music critics, industry executives, fellow artists, and casual viewers would all be judging whether Whitney Houston could deliver the performance of a lifetime. For most artists, this would be exciting. For Whitney, in her current state of anxiety and exhaustion, it felt like walking toward her own execution. The day of the Grammys started badly and got progressively worse. During the afternoon rehearsal, Whitney's voice had been slightly hoarse from lack of sleep and dehydration. It was nothing serious, nothing that a professional singer couldn't work through, but to Whitney's anxiety-ridden mind, it was confirmation of her worst fears. She was going to fail. She was going to embarrass herself. She was going to prove that all the success, all the accolades, all the worship had been built on a foundation that was about to crumble in front of the entire world. By the time she arrived at Radio City Music Hall that evening, Whitney was already in the grip of a full-blown panic attack. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was racing so fast she thought she might be having a cardiac event. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. And the voice inside her head, the cruel voice that anxiety always brings, was telling her that she was about to experience the most humiliating moment of her career. Whitney's dressing room at Radio City Music Hall was supposed to be her sanctuary, a place where she could center herself before the performance. Instead, it had become a pressure cooker where all her fears and anxieties were reaching a critical mass. She had tried everything her team suggested. Deep breathing exercises that only made her more aware of how hard it was to breathe. Positive affirmations that felt like lies when she spoke them out loud. Vocal warm-ups that made her more convinced that her voice wasn't cooperating. Nothing was working. The more she tried to calm down, the more panicked she became. At 18 minutes until showtime, Whitney's makeup artist noticed that she was crying, which meant her makeup would need to be completely redone. At 17 minutes, her vocal coach tried to get her to do a simple scale, and Whitney couldn't get through it without her voice cracking. At 16 minutes, Whitney told everyone in the room to get out. She needed to be alone. But being alone made everything worse. Without the distraction of other people, Whitney was left with only her terror and the relentless ticking of the clock. At 15 minutes until showtime, Whitney Houston collapsed. Not physically, but mentally and emotionally. She slid down the wall of her dressing room until she was sitting on the floor, her expensive gown pooling around her, her perfectly styled hair beginning to come loose, her carefully applied makeup streaking down her face. And she began to sob with a depth of despair that shocked even herself. "I can't do this," she kept saying to the empty room. "I can't do this. I can't do this." The words became a mantra, a desperate prayer to a universe that wasn't listening. Outside her dressing room, the Grammy production team was beginning to panic. The assistant director had knocked on Whitney's door 3 times with no response. The stage manager had tried calling her dressing room phone. Nothing. They had 14 minutes until Whitney Houston was supposed to walk onto that stage and deliver one of the most important performances in Grammy history, and nobody knew where she was mentally or whether she would even be able to perform. That's when someone suggested they find Denzel Washington. Denzel was at the Grammys that night as a presenter, scheduled to announce one of the major awards later in the evening. He and Whitney had remained close friends since their rooftop conversation 2 years earlier at the Bodyguard premiere. The production team knew that if anyone could reach Whitney in whatever dark place she had gone, it would be Denzel. They found him in the green room, and when they explained the situation, Denzel didn't hesitate. He headed immediately toward Whitney's dressing room, his mind already working through what he would say, how he would help his friend through what sounded like the worst panic attack of her life. As he approached her dressing room, he could hear her through the door. Not words exactly, but the sound of someone in profound distress. He knocked gently and called her name. No response. He knocked again, more firmly this time, and said the words that would make her open the door. "Whit, it's D. I'm coming in whether you unlock this or not, so you might as well save me the embarrassment of having security break down the door." There was a long pause, and then Denzel heard the sound of the lock clicking. He pushed the door open slowly and found Whitney exactly where she had been for the past 15 minutes, sitting on the floor in her Grammy gown, makeup destroyed, hair disheveled, looking nothing like the superstar the world expected to see in 13 minutes. Denzel stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and locked it again. Then he did something that surprised everyone on the production team who was anxiously waiting outside. He told them all to leave. Every assistant, every producer, every person who had been hovering outside Whitney's door trying to figure out how to fix this crisis was told to go away and give them space. "But we only have 13 minutes, the stage manager protested. "Then we better not waste them talking to you," Denzel replied firmly, and shut the door in their faces. Inside the dressing room, Denzel didn't immediately try to fix anything. He didn't tell Whitney to calm down or remind her that 20 million people were waiting or try to give her a pep talk about how talented she was. Instead, he walked over to where she was sitting on the floor, and without saying a word, he sat down beside her. Not hovering over her, not trying to pull her up, just sitting with her in her crisis. They sat in silence for almost a full minute while Whitney's breathing gradually began to slow from hyperventilation to something closer to normal. Finally, Denzel spoke, and his voice was quiet, calm, and completely devoid of judgment. "Tell me what's happening right now. Not what you think should be happening. Not what everyone expects. Just what's actually happening inside you right now." Whitney wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing what remained of her makeup even further. When she spoke, her voice was small and broken, nothing like the powerful instrument the world knew. "I'm terrified. I'm so terrified that I can barely breathe. I've sung this song 1,000 times. I know every note, every breath, every moment. But right now, sitting here, I can't remember how to do it. It's like my brain has erased everything I know about singing, and all I can think about is walking out on that stage and failing in front of everyone." She looked at Denzel with eyes that held genuine fear. "What if I go out there and I can't hit the notes? What if my voice cracks? What if I forget the words? What if this is the moment everyone realizes that Whitney Houston isn't actually as good as they thought she was?" Denzel listened without interrupting, letting Whitney articulate the fears that had been building inside her for months. When she finished, he nodded slowly, as if considering everything she had said with complete seriousness. "Okay," he said finally. So you're afraid of being human. You're afraid that if you're not perfect, people will stop loving you. You're afraid that one mistake will erase everything you've accomplished. Does that about sum it up? Whitney nodded miserably. Denzel shifted his position so he could look directly at her. Let me tell you what's actually going to happen tonight, Whit. You're going to walk out on that stage and you're going to sing that song. And you know what? You might not be perfect. Your voice might crack on one note. You might forget a word or miss a cue. You might have to adjust your breathing or change a run because your nerves are affecting your technique. And if any of those things happen, you know what the 20 million people watching are going to think. Whitney looked at him, waiting for the answer she was dreading. They're going to think, wow, Whitney Houston is human. She's not a perfect machine. She's a real person up there giving everything she has. And they're going to love you even more for it. Whitney shook her head, not convinced. You don't understand. I can't be human. Whitney Houston doesn't get to be human. Whitney Houston has to be perfect every single time because that's what people expect. That's what I've built my entire career on. If I show vulnerability, if I make mistakes, then what was the point of any of it? Denzel recognized this thinking because he had struggled with it himself throughout his career. It was the toxic belief that success required perfection, and perfection required hiding any hint of humanity. He knew from painful personal experience that this belief was not only false, but destructive. Let me tell you about something that happened to me, Denzel said, shifting into storytelling mode, because sometimes the best way to reach someone is through shared experience. You remember when I did Malcolm X? That was the most important role of my career up to that point. Playing Malcolm X wasn't just acting, it was representing a historical figure who meant everything to Black America. The pressure was crushing. He paused, making sure Whitney was listening. On the first day of filming, we were doing the scene where Malcolm addresses the crowd after the fruit of Islam surrounds him. Simple scene, just a few lines. But I was so terrified of not living up to Malcolm's legacy that I couldn't get through a single take without messing up. I forgot lines I had memorized for weeks. I stumbled over blocking I had practiced 100 times. After the 6th failed take, Spike Lee called cut and took me aside. I thought he was going to fire me. Whitney was watching Denzel intently now, her own crisis momentarily forgotten as she listened to his story. But instead of yelling at me or questioning whether he had made a mistake casting me, Spike said something I'll never forget. He said, Denzel, you're trying to be Malcolm X, but you're not Malcolm X, you're Denzel playing Malcolm X, and the only way this works is if you bring Denzel's humanity to Malcolm's story. Stop trying to disappear into perfection. Start letting yourself be present in the imperfection. What did you do? Whitney asked. I stopped trying to be perfect, Denzel replied. I stopped trying to channel Malcolm X and started thinking about what Malcolm's words meant to me, Denzel Washington, a Black man from Mount Vernon who grew up watching Malcolm's speeches and feeling inspired. I let myself be nervous. I let myself make mistakes. I let myself be human. And you know what? The performance that ended up in the film, the one that got me an Oscar nomination, came from that place of imperfect humanity, not from trying to be a perfect representation of a historical figure. He reached over and took Whitney's hand. You're doing the same thing I was doing, Whit. You're trying to be the perfect version of Whitney Houston instead of just being Whitney, a woman from Newark who has an incredible gift for singing and who happens to be terrified right now. And that's okay. Being terrified doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. Whitney was quiet for a moment, processing what Denzel had said. The clock was still ticking. They now had 9 minutes until showtime, but something in Whitney's body language had shifted. The rigid panic that had been holding her hostage was beginning to loosen its grip. But what if I go out there and I'm not good enough? She asked, and this was the core fear, the root of all the anxiety and terror. Not good enough. Never good enough. Always having to prove her worth through perfection. Denzel squeezed her hand gently. Good enough for who, Whit? Good enough for the critics who will judge you no matter what you do. Good enough for the industry that will always want more from you. Good enough for fans who have built you up into something superhuman. Or good enough for you? That question hit Whitney like a physical blow because it revealed something she had never consciously articulated. She had spent her entire career trying to be good enough for everyone else, but she had never once asked herself if she was good enough for her own standards, her own values, her own sense of what mattered. I don't know, she admitted quietly. I don't know what good enough for me even means anymore. Denzel nodded, understanding completely. Then let me tell you what I think good enough for you should mean. It means going out on that stage and giving everything you have in this moment. Not everything you had yesterday or last week or a year ago when you recorded that song. Everything you have right now, sitting here on this floor, terrified and human and real. That's what good enough means. He stood up and held out his hand to help Whitney up. She took it and rose slowly, her gown wrinkled and her makeup ruined, but her breathing finally steady. The truth is, Whit, you're not going to give a perfect performance tonight. Perfect doesn't exist. Perfect is a myth we tell ourselves to avoid being vulnerable. But you know what you can give? You can give a real performance. You can give an honest performance. You can give a performance that comes from your heart instead of from your fear. And that performance, imperfect as it might be, will be more powerful than any technical perfection could ever be. Whitney looked at herself in the mirror and winced at what she saw. Her makeup was destroyed, her hair was a mess, and she looked like she had been crying for hours, which she had. "I look terrible," she said, and there was almost a laugh in her voice, the first hint of humor she had shown all evening. "You look human," Denzel corrected. "And you have 7 minutes for your team to fix the makeup and hair. But your heart, your spirit, your humanity, those are already perfect exactly as they are." He walked with her to the door and unlocked it. Outside, the production team was in full crisis mode, but the moment they saw Whitney standing upright and breathing normally, relief flooded their faces. "We need makeup and hair in here now," Denzel commanded. "And everyone else needs to give her space. She's going to perform and she's going to be magnificent, but she's going to do it her way." The next 6 minutes were a blur of activity as Whitney's team worked frantically to repair her makeup and hair. They didn't have time to make her look perfect, but they managed to make her look presentable, which in this moment was more than enough. As they worked, Denzel stayed in the room, a quiet presence that reminded Whitney she wasn't alone. When the stage manager came to the door with a 3-minute warning, Whitney felt the panic trying to resurface. Her breath caught, her heart started racing again, and the voice in her head began its cruel litany of all the ways she could fail. But then she felt Denzel's hand on her shoulder, steady and grounding. "Remember," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "You're not trying to be perfect tonight. You're just trying to be real. And real is always enough." Whitney nodded and took a deep breath that came from somewhere deeper than her diaphragm, somewhere in her soul where fear couldn't reach. She walked out of the dressing room and toward the stage, her team scrambling to keep up with her. As she reached the wings and could hear the audience applause and see the lights of the stage, she made a conscious decision to let go of perfection and embrace whatever was about to happen. The introduction came, the lights shifted, and Whitney Houston walked onto the Grammy stage in front of 20 million people. She looked different than she normally did at major performances. Her makeup wasn't quite as flawless. Her hair wasn't quite as perfectly styled. And in her eyes, if you looked closely, you could see the remnants of tears and fear and genuine human vulnerability. She took her position at the microphone, and in the split second before the music started, she made eye contact with Denzel, who had positioned himself in the wings where she could see him. He gave her the smallest nod, a reminder of everything they had talked about in that dressing room. Be real, be human, be enough. The opening notes of "I Will Always Love You" filled Radio City Music Hall, and Whitney began to sing. Her voice, that incredible instrument that had made her famous, started softly, tentatively, not with the overwhelming power everyone expected, but with something quieter and more intimate. It wasn't the performance she had planned. It wasn't the perfect, technically flawless version she had been obsessively rehearsing. It was something else entirely. As the song progressed and built toward its famous climax, something extraordinary happened. Whitney stopped performing and started feeling. Every word came from a place of genuine emotion rather than technical precision. When her voice cracked slightly on one note, she didn't panic or try to cover it. She let it be part of the moment, a reminder that this was a live human being singing live human emotions. When she reached the iconic final chorus, the part where her voice typically soared to impossible heights with perfect control, Whitney made a choice. Instead of trying to hit every note with mechanical precision, she let her voice express what she was actually feeling in that moment. Fear and courage, vulnerability and strength, imperfection and truth. The result was a performance that music critics would later call one of the most emotionally powerful renditions of the song ever delivered. It wasn't technically perfect. There were small flaws, tiny moments where her voice didn't do exactly what vocal perfectionists might have expected. But those imperfections made the performance real in a way that perfection never could. 20 million people watching at home felt something they had never felt before from Whitney Houston. They felt her humanity. When Whitney finished the final note and the audience erupted in applause, she stood at the microphone for a moment, tears streaming down her face, and realized something profound. She had done it. She had walked through her fear, performed without the armor of perfection, and not only survived but created something beautiful. As she walked off stage, Denzel was there waiting, and she collapsed into his arms, crying again, but these were different tears. These were tears of relief and release and the realization that she had just experienced something transformative. "You did it," Denzel said, holding her steady. "You were real and you were magnificent." Whitney pulled back and looked at him, her face streaked with tears and stage makeup. "I wasn't perfect," she said, and there was wonder in her voice as if she was discovering something for the first time. "I messed up at least 3 times, but it was okay. It was more than okay. It was real." Reviews of Whitney's Grammy performance reflected exactly what Denzel had predicted. Music critics praised the emotional depth and vulnerability she had displayed. Fellow artists called it one of the most moving performances they had ever witnessed. And fans, the 20 million people who had watched from their homes, said they had never felt more connected to Whitney Houston than they did during those 4 minutes when she let them see her humanity. In the days following the Grammys, Whitney Houston had countless opportunities to reflect on what had happened that night. The panic attack, the breakdown, the conversation with Denzel, and the performance that had emerged from embracing her imperfection rather than hiding from it. She realized that the pursuit of perfection had been slowly killing her, turning something she loved into something she feared. And she understood that the only path forward was to start prioritizing authenticity over flawlessness. This wasn't an overnight transformation. Whitney would continue to struggle with performance anxiety, with the pressure of expectations, with the weight of being Whitney Houston. But that Grammy night became a reference point, a moment she could return to when the pressure became too much. A reminder that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that imperfection wasn't failure, and that sometimes the most powerful thing an artist can do is let the audience see them as they truly are. Years later, when Whitney would talk about the 1994 Grammys in rare, candid interviews, she would always mention Denzel and what his presence had meant that night. "He saved my performance," she would say. "But more than that, he saved me from drowning in my own fear. He reminded me that I didn't have to be perfect to be worthy." And that reminder in that moment was the difference between walking onto that stage and running away from it entirely. Denzel, for his part, would always downplay his role. "I just sat with my friend when she needed someone to sit with her," he would say when asked about that night. "I reminded her of something she already knew but had forgotten, that her value as a human being isn't determined by how perfectly she hits a note. That's all I did." But it wasn't all he did. He had recognized a friend in crisis and responded with exactly what she needed. Not a pep talk or empty reassurances, but honest conversation about the shared struggle of maintaining humanity in an industry that demands superhuman perfection. He had offered her his own vulnerability as a gift, sharing his own failures and fears to help her feel less alone in hers. The friendship between Whitney Houston and Denzel Washington, forged in that rooftop conversation 2 years earlier and deepened in that frantic dressing room before the Grammys, became one of the most important relationships in both their lives. They understood each other in a way that few others could, both of them navigating the impossible pressures of being Black excellence in an industry that was simultaneously fascinated by and threatened by their success. They knew what it felt like to carry the weight of representation, to feel like every mistake was a referendum not just on themselves, but on their entire community. And they knew the exhaustion that came from always having to be on, always having to be perfect, always having to prove that they deserved their success. In Denzel, Whitney had found someone who could see past the Whitney Houston persona to the scared, vulnerable human beneath. Someone who didn't need her to be perfect or put together or strong all the time. Someone who would sit on floors and in dressing rooms and wherever else she needed him to be when the weight became too heavy to carry alone. And in Whitney, Denzel had found someone who understood his own struggles with success and perfection, someone who reminded him that vulnerability was not weakness and that asking for help was not failure. Their friendship would be tested many times in the years that followed. Whitney's struggles with substance abuse and her turbulent marriage would strain even their strongest bonds. There would be times when Denzel felt helpless, unable to save his friend from the demons that were consuming her. Times when Whitney would push everyone away, including the people who loved her most. But the foundation built on that hotel rooftop and strengthened in that Radio City Music Hall dressing room, never completely crumbled. Even in Whitney's darkest periods, Denzel remained a voice of reason and unconditional love. He never judged. He never condemned. He simply continued to be present, to offer support, and to remind her that her worth was not determined by her career or her public image or her ability to be perfect. When Whitney died in 2012, Denzel was devastated. He had watched his friend struggle for so long, had tried so many times to help her find peace, and in the end, he hadn't been able to save her. But he also knew that the love and support he had offered over the years, starting with that night before the Grammys, had given Whitney moments of relief from the crushing pressure she lived under. Moments where she could breathe and be human and feel worthy exactly as she was. The story of what happened backstage at the 1994 Grammy Awards is not widely known. Whitney never spoke about it publicly in detail, and Denzel has remained respectfully quiet about that night, honoring the privacy of a moment that was deeply personal for his friend. But the people who were there, who witnessed Whitney's breakdown and Denzel's intervention, and the extraordinary performance that emerged from that crisis, have never forgotten what they saw. They saw what happens when we create a culture that demands perfection from its artists. They saw the psychological toll of constant pressure to be flawless. They saw how close we came to losing one of the greatest performances in Grammy history because a talented woman was so terrified of being human that she almost couldn't function. And they saw how the simple act of sitting with someone in their pain, offering honest conversation about shared struggles, and giving permission to be imperfect can transform panic into power. The performance itself has become legendary, not just because of Whitney's incredible voice, but because of the emotional authenticity she brought to it. People who watch the footage today often comment on how different she seems in this performance compared to others. How raw and vulnerable and present she appears. How the small imperfections in her delivery make the performance more powerful rather than less. Music educators use this performance as an example of how technical perfection is less important than emotional truth. They point out the moments where Whitney's voice wavers or cracks, and they explain how those moments of human vulnerability create connection with the audience in ways that flawless technique never could. The 1994 Grammy performance became a turning point in Whitney's relationship with her own artistry. It didn't solve all her problems or eliminate her struggles with anxiety and pressure, but it gave her a framework for understanding that perfection was not the goal. Connection was the goal. Truth was the goal. Humanity was the goal. And sometimes, the most perfect thing an artist can do is to let themselves be imperfect. For Denzel, that night reinforced something he had been learning throughout his career. That the most important role he would ever play was not in any film or on any stage, but in the lives of the people he loved. Being present for Whitney in her moment of crisis, offering his own vulnerability as a gift, and helping her find the courage to walk onto that stage despite her terror, these were the moments that mattered most. Not the awards or the accolades or the critical acclaim, but the human connections that reminded both of them why they had started performing in the first place. The story of Whitney Houston's 1994 Grammy performance is ultimately a story about what it costs to be excellent in a world that confuses excellence with perfection. It's about the difference between performing for validation and performing for expression. It's about the courage it takes to be vulnerable in front of millions of people. And it's about the friends who hold us together when we're falling apart, who remind us of our humanity when we're drowning in expectations, and who sit with us on floors and in dressing rooms and give us permission to be imperfect. If you've ever felt paralyzed by the fear of not being good enough, if you've ever experienced anxiety that made you question everything you know how to do, if you've ever needed someone to remind you that your worth is not determined by your performance, then Whitney's story is your story too. Because the pressure to be perfect, the fear of showing vulnerability, the exhaustion of maintaining an image, these are not celebrity problems. These are human problems. They just become more visible when they happen to people in the spotlight. So what do we do with this story? How do we honor Whitney's struggle and Denzel's friendship without reducing it to simple lessons or easy answers? We start by giving ourselves permission to be imperfect. We recognize that vulnerability is not weakness, but courage. We understand that asking for help is not failure, but wisdom. We stop judging ourselves and others by impossible standards of perfection. And we start valuing authenticity over performance, humanity over image, and connection over validation. Most importantly, we become the kind of friend that Denzel was to Whitney, the kind of person who shows up when someone is falling apart, the kind of person who sits in the mess without trying to immediately fix it, the kind of person who offers their own vulnerability as proof that imperfection is not only acceptable but beautiful. Because at the end of the day, we don't need more perfect people. We need more real people. We need more honest conversations about struggle. We need more friends who remind us that we are worthy exactly as we are, imperfections and all. The night before Whitney Houston gave one of the most memorable Grammy performances in history, she sat on a dressing room floor, convinced she had forgotten how to sing. And a friend sat beside her and reminded her that perfection was not the goal. Being human was the goal. That reminder saved the performance. But more importantly, it saved Whitney, at least for that night, from drowning in the impossible pressure of being Whitney Houston. Who in your life needs permission to be imperfect today? Who needs to hear that their worth is not determined by their performance? Who needs a friend to sit with them in their crisis and remind them that being human is enough? Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below about a time when you let go of perfection and found something more real. And if this resonated with you, subscribe and hit that notification bell because we're committed to telling stories that honor the humanity behind the headlines, the vulnerability behind the success, and the friendships that hold us together when everything else falls apart. Until next time, remember that you are not your achievements. You are not your failures. You are not your performance. You are human, beautifully and perfectly imperfect, and that is more than enough. You have always been enough.